You're listening to a Revolution Truth podcast, GTMO, the Rule of Law and the NDAA, a live panel discussion with David Remes and Andy Worthington, hosted by Tangerine Bolen and Pamela Sue Taylor.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our Revolution Truth live streaming panel on Guantanamo, the rule of law, and the NDAA. Although Guantanamo has become a footnote in the U.S. government's ongoing war on terror, the prison is the antithesis of everything the United States was founded upon, a republic dedicated to the rule of law and defined by one of the most principled documents in human history, the U.S. Constitution. While GTMO, as it's called, may be a footnote in the war on terror, and indeed in our collective consciousness, alternately relegated to, quote, old news and used by foaming at the mouth far-right Republicans in Congress to conjure images of mass murderers capable of escaping even the most high-tech of military detention facilities in the U.S., the reality of GTMO is far different. The prison itself stands as a stark example of the duality of U.S. exceptionalism. It is the dark side of the coin where we are not exceptional solely because historically we have fought for and lauded democratic rights, but exceptional because we consider ourselves above the rule of law. The United States is not beholden to the same international laws, rules, and conventions we demand of nearly every other nation. And in the name of the war on terror, we have created a black hole in Cuba, a Dante-esque world largely hidden from the public view but distinctly merciless. And in this world is, after all, relevant to each of us, and we'll show you why today. The goal of our conversation today is not only to remind people that GTMO is not a footnote, it's also to bring home the realities of indefinite detention and the slow and steady creep of lawlessness that is packaged as the war on terror. It will be to show how the lack of political will to seize that profound erosion translates into the loss of our most fundamental rights on our own shores, most recently in the guise of the National Defense Authorization Act. Joining us today to give us an inside look at GTMO and to discuss the shifting landscape of indefinite detention and indefinite detention are two men who have dedicated their lives to redressing GTMO abuses. First, we have David Remes. He is a human rights lawyer best known for his representation of Guantanamo detainees, including Adnan Latif. Mr. Remes also litigates civil liberties cases, including a First Amendment challenge by Christopher Hedges, myself, and others to the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. He left a high-level DC law firm where he was partner in 2008 to devote himself exclusively to human rights and civil liberties law and advocacy. Alongside David Remes is Andy Worthington, a British historian, investigative journalist, and film director. He has published 3 books and been published in numerous publications. In 2009, Worthington was co-director of a documentary about the Guantanamo detainees. He has published what has been described as the most definitive annotated list of all Guantanamo detainees. His most recent book is the Guantanamo Files, the stories of the 774 detainees in America's illegal prison. And for the first time ever, we have a co-host today. That's Pamela Sue Taylor, my colleague in Australia. She holds a Bachelor of Counterterrorism and Security degree from Murdoch University in Australia, is a convener for Amnesty International Australia, and analyzes cables via WikiLeaks regularly on her own talk show, Meaningless Words. She's also an ardent advocate of civil liberties both at home and abroad. And finally, I'm your host, Tangerine Bolen. I'm the founder and director of Revolution Truth, an organization dedicated to civil liberties and social justice. And I'm also a plaintiff and coordinator of the Hedges v. Obama lawsuit against the NDAA. So welcome, everybody. We're really glad to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, I want to start with Andy, specifically because, all of a sudden Revolution Truth decided to do a panel on Guantanamo. And I think for a lot of U.S. citizens, unfortunately, Guantanamo seems to be, quote, old news. We have a culture, obviously, here of sort of information and entertainment junkies and collectively a short-term memory. So what makes Guantanamo as relevant today to our listeners as it ever has been?
Well, Guantanamo has been a disgraceful setup from the moment that it opened. But at the beginning, because there was such understandable anger about what had happened on September 11th, 2001, then, apart from people very finely attuned to what the law is supposed to mean, people were encouraged not to notice and didn't at the beginning. But, historically, there are only two ways in which any civilized society deprives a person of their liberty. And one of those ways is that you are accused of a criminal activity and you are put forward for a trial in the federal court, and if found guilty, you're imprisoned. The other way is that you are imprisoned as a prisoner of war and held humanely until the end of hostilities. Well, the Bush administration didn't do that. It decided to hold people as illegal enemy combatants, and actually the point was to hold people without any rights whatsoever. I mean, really, they were intended to have no rights, and they really didn't have any rights until 2.5 years after the prison opened. The Supreme Court gave them, said that they had habeas corpus rights. So, the situation that still exists at Guantanamo is that these people are a unique category of human being. And as we've seen with the obstacles and the failures of closing the prison, whatever rights they are supposed to have managed to have clawed back over the last nearly 11 years effectively mean nothing. It's almost impossible for living prisoners to leave Guantanamo these days. This has been the situation for the last 2 years. Of the last 8 people who have left Guantanamo, 3 of them left coffins. It remains this disgrace, and it's a relatively small number of people who are held there, but they are still the people without rights. That was first established by the Bush administration, essentially, and that ought to be something that is regarded as dangerous and disgraceful by the American people.
So I think that, obviously you feel that way, I feel that way, everyone on this call, I assume, feels that way. How do we bring this home for people, however, who historically they've had a picture painted for them by these politicians in Congress and political talking pundits who paint a picture of just an exaggerated picture of just these are horrible, terrifying terrorists out to annihilate the United States. I mean, obviously, those kind of people do exist in the world, but how many of them are at Guantanamo, and what is the reality? What is the actual reality of Guantanamo today, in a summary, David?
Well, I think that we're never going to be able to undo the public perception of the men at Guantanamo as the worst of the worst. That I think is something that we're going to have to live with. I think, though, that most people aren't really interested in Guantanamo, and most people aren't really in a good position to play a role in what happens with Guantanamo, because this has come to be sort of inside baseball in Washington, and it's politics between Democrats and Republicans and the administration. And I realize that that mass appeals are great. I do think they can influence the administration. I really do. But I think that really the ultimate problem to resolve is a political problem, a problem of political will.
Right. I mean, we've just seen Lindsey Graham on the Senate floor calling the inmates at Guantanamo crazy bastards. And while some of them may be, according to my research, there are 56 Yemeni citizens who have been cleared for release for quite some time. And if my research is correct, the majority of prisoners in the last few years, or at least a majority of prisoners over time, are actually innocent men who, for the most part, were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Is this correct, or is that sort of an exaggerated view on the other side of things? One of you.
I think that you're absolutely right, Tangerine. I need to backtrack a little bit on what I said before, not to change it or anything, but to emphasize something else. That when polls were done, public polling was done on the Guantanamo question, should it be closed or should it remain, in a broad sense, you get a different set of responses than when you focus on particular issues, like do you think that men who have been approved for transfer should be transferred or should be kept there for the rest of their lives? I'm kind of exaggerating.
Right.
That is, you can go on and say these guys are the worst of the worst, and we can't come back and say, no, they're not. What we have to focus on is the injustice of having people approved but then not released, or treatment of people like Adnan Latif as sort of a poster child for the cruelty of Guantanamo in general. But just talking about the abstract issue, I don't think gets very far.
Yeah, actually, I'd like to hone in, leave the abstract behind for a moment and hone in on Adnan Latif's story. Obviously, David, you are closer to that story than just about anyone but his own family, and I think our audience really needs to hear this story firsthand, and I'll just give a quick synopsis. Adnan was a Yemeni citizen who, it was that classic case of in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had traveled to Afghanistan, at least to my knowledge, because he was seeking free care for a brain injury he had incurred in a serious car accident some number of years before, and was caught in the bombing of Kabul and was trying to get away and ended up being scooped up by Pakistani forces at the border and sold as a bounty to the Northern Alliance, and then spent over a decade in indefinite detention, was tortured, subjected to dehumanizing treatment on a day-to-day basis, and finally completely gave up and committed suicide this past September. So, David, correct me if any of those facts are wrong, but first and foremost, I just want to extend my condolences and the condolences of my team for the loss that you have just faced, and also our gratitude for the work that you do.
Well, thanks, Tangerine.
Yeah.
It was very, very sad, and it's sad when I think of it, but I've responded to it, as others have, by really trying to get to the bottom of it and to put the lie to the administration's narrative. Their narrative hasn't been fully developed yet, but they conclude in the autopsy report that he died from over-medication, and that he committed suicide by over-medicating himself. So basically, it's another suicide story. I guess they maintain that he hoarded pills, or that's the way it'll come out. My viewpoint, and that of some other people I know, is that at this point it's been refined to the point where I think that the military, somewhere along the way, whether it was the officer in charge of Camp 5 where he was located, or higher up, left extra pills in the cell to which he was sent. And given his psychological condition, he took advantage of that as they expected he would. It was sort of a suicide prompt, sort of a grotesque kind of assisted suicide. So what we're trying to do is explode the government's theory just by proving that in order for the government to be right about the hoarding, there'd have to be about 15 systems breakdowns in terms of inspection and care and administration of medicine. I don't need to go into details, but I'll tell you one other thing, and I'm sorry if this is rambling a little bit. I just want to tell you where we're going here. I discovered a letter that Adnan had written a few years ago in which he foresaw this scenario. He said in this letter, they're going to kill me and make it look like I committed suicide.
Wow.
So there you have it. And, what we're just trying to do is dig deep in the face of total intransigence by DOD.
What would be the impetus for, or the rationale for encouraging his suicide? I mean, what did the government have to stand, or the guards at GTMO have to stand for allowing that to happen, or even encouraging it?
Well, in his case, he was just a real thorn in their side. They did not know how to handle him. He refused to be broken. And I'm not saying that the other men refused to be broken, but the other men sort of bent, but not Adnan, and therefore it was sort of a setup for him to break, if that comes across. The guards didn't know how to handle him. They would ask the other detainees, how can we handle Adnan? He was extremely resourceful in confounding them, fooling them, and he was just driving them crazy. So I think that at the end of the day, they wanted to get rid of a long-standing, severe nuisance. And let me add that this isn't the first time this has happened at Guantanamo. I have another client who reported to me in July 2009 that he had gone back to his cell and discovered scissors and sharp metal objects. And he was scared out of his mind. When I've met with clients, I found them sort of just normal moods, sometimes angry moods, bitter moods, and the like. I've never seen any client show fear, and fear was on this other client's face. And then I have hearsay reports from another client, and who knows with respect to the detainees who I don't represent. I don't think that anything is beneath the military in Guantanamo. I think they'll stop at nothing, and they'll hide everything.
Wow, and I read in one of his letters that Andy so kindly published, the letters Adnan had written to you, David, an alternate scenario, and this is not to contradict what you've just described. I just want to throw out this question. In one of his letters, he actually said he hoped at some point that his guards would look the other way, or turn the other way, basically. Do you think that scenario is at all possible as well? That someone took, felt mercy toward him and just did not think he was ever going to be released, as we could see, and thought they were helping him? Or do you think that this is more likely just a more malicious sort of situation?
Well, let me start out with an indirect answer to your question, which is that there is no dispute that he said time and again that he wished to commit suicide. Okay. And was looking for an opportunity to commit suicide. And there's no dispute that he tried on a substantial number of occasions to commit suicide. But that doesn't mean that his death here was a suicide. And the autopsy report, which the government and Yemen are holding on to for dear life and keeping secret, says that it was suicide through over-medication. But the suicide conclusion is just a theory, because when you have a dead body full of medication, and let's assume that it is, you still don't know how the medication got in there. So they have their theory, we have our theory, and somebody else may have another theory. Now, in the question of whether this was sort of a mercy, that whoever did it wasn't killing him because he hated Adnan, but was leaving the situation where Adnan could commit suicide as an act of mercy, as you say, it's very hard to accept that because of the very strict controls on the stock of medications and the controls on the administration.
Okay. Well, multiple journalists have described Adnan as the face of indefinite detention. And I know what we want to do here today is really kind of get into the nitty-gritty of indefinite detention and the shifting landscape of the rule of law and how the legacy of Guantanamo has affected the rule of law. So bringing this back out a little bit more to the abstract, I want to come back to Adnan's case in just a little bit here. But Andy, I've seen the terms latent terrorists and conditional detention. I think the latter of which definitely applies to Adnan's case. And can you speak a little bit about those terms for us?
Well, I hadn't heard the first one before, but you know that's been part of the problem all along. Is that once you start detaining people in this kind of random manner, you then start to get people justifying it by claiming that, you know, if you've got somebody and you regard them as dangerous, then you're preventing them from doing something that they may do. And that's turning our understanding of the basis of detention on its head completely, because it needs to be based on something you have actually done. And that's why really we're back to the issue of holding people either as criminal suspects or as prisoners of war. And when you don't do that, then you end up with all these grey areas which are exploited. And they have been exploited, you know, remorselessly by people who actually, I think, love the idea of putting people in prison and throwing away the key. Now, you know, it seems not to occur to them that's one of the classic definitions of brutal, horrible, inhumane, totalitarian regimes. But that's what they want to do. And when Lindsey Graham stands up and talks about the crazy bastards in Guantanamo, you know, he's dissembling there, because there are other crazy bastards, as he would call them, who have been through federal court trials and are safely imprisoned in these incredibly safe and secure and horribly cruel maximum security prisons that the United States has. There is no actual basis for attempting to distinguish between people convicted of terrible multiple homicidal crimes imprisoned in the United States domestic prisons and anyone that's in Guantanamo. There are people as bad, if you like, as anybody in Guantanamo, of the handful of people accused of serious crimes. So, you know, it's shifted the arguments into an area where they should never have gone. So indefinite detention is not supposed to be a possibility, but it has become one because these people had no rights. And they had no rights because the context in which they're being held is a conflict, but not a traditional military conflict as far as the United States has framed it. So it's it's a war on terror without end. We can call it what we want. It's now seems more generally to be referred to as the long war. Nobody wants to put an end date. It's interesting that in Oxford last week, Jay Johnson, the senior Pentagon lawyer, started speaking about there being an end to it, framing it within this military context. Because at the end of a military conflict, you let people go home. So, you know, the only way the indefinite detention thing has arisen, and I'm sure we're going to go on and talk about how in the NDAA, lawmakers have interpreted that as though it can be applied more widely, that there are new definitions of ways it can be used. It starts with Guantanamo, and it starts with that breaking of the fundamental rules of detention that were undertaken very deliberately by the administration with the intention of creating prisoners who had no rights, who had no way out of anything that happened to them, no way of establishing that they were innocent if they were, no way of resisting the abuse and torture to which they were subjected when all the doors to any way out, any accountability had been shut. So that's where it all comes back to. And it's so fundamental, the simple reason everything about Guantanamo is wrong. Unfortunately, all the layers on top of it have been put there in an attempt in a state of fear. But fundamentally, it all comes back to the problem of training people who essentially just don't have proper rights and can be messed around with to horrible extent that we see in the case of Adnan Latif, where here's a man that apparently, on several occasions, not apparently, I mean, it has been stated on several occasions that the United States doesn't want to hold this person, and yet they die in the prison that they're still held in. It doesn't happen in other contexts, and it should not happen in any other context, because it's a disgraceful way to behave.
You know, it's amazing because the conditions that you described and this total lack of a recourse to justice that the Guantanamo detainees have faced are actually the very same conditions that would be imposed by the National Defense Authorization Act's version of indefinite detention as well. It would be military detainment, and in that sense, there have been no rules or regulations stipulated ensuring that detainees have access to family or friends who could at least seek habeas relief on their behalf. And obviously that's one of the most egregious things that we are suing over. But in between those two, because I want to get back to the NDAA momentarily, but in between, in that arc from Guantanamo to the NDAA, we seem to have had a breakdown on a global scale of a number of things. At least other countries have not had either the will or the strength to hold us accountable. And I think, Pamela, you have a question about the United Nations and on this front as far as indefinite detention goes. So take it away.
Thank you, yes. Well, exactly. The United Nations is supposed to uphold international laws, and yet they really didn't investigate the indefinite detention situation in Guantanamo Bay enough to affect change. And now we can see, recently, we have it being made legal in retrospect via the NDAA. Could the United Nations have seen this coming and therefore not assisted the detainees as much as they should have?
I don't think that the United Nations could do any more than it did. You know, the United Nations attempted on numerous occasions to have access to the prisoners in Guantanamo, to be able to visit them and to speak to them free of any interference, and to objectively then come up with its own analysis of what was happening. And the Bush administration refused to allow that, and you know, President Obama hasn't allowed any UN visitor either. They've tied their hands, and you know, unfortunately, with the United States, you know, the United States government behaves as though it's not beholden to any international laws and treaties. You know, it's not signed up to the International Criminal Court, so there's no way of pursuing that as an avenue. Nobody can really do anything more than has happened, which is that the complete failure of any of the bodies within the United States to hold senior government officials and their lawyers accountable has led to other countries having to try and initiate cases. They don't get any support from the United States government at all. The most that we've had in terms of any accountability, because of the United States' refusal to engage with anything, is that you know, it's very probable that most of the senior officials in the Bush administration, including George W. Bush, think very carefully about where they travel around the world. You know, because President Bush called off nearly 2 years ago a visit to Switzerland because a huge statement describing his involvement in torture was going to be delivered to the Swiss government the moment that he landed. And under the obligations of the UN Convention Against Torture, to which we're all signed up, that was supposed to mean that he would be arrested. So he didn't risk it. He called off his visit. You know, Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and John Yoo and David Addington and all these people are probably thinking carefully about where they travel internationally. But that's the extent to which anybody's been able to get anywhere close to holding anybody responsible for what they did. So, you know, the mechanisms, the United States doesn't, the United Nations doesn't have the muscle power to do anything because the United States has the arrogance, really, to say that no one has the right to touch them.
I'd like to interject, if I may, and say that I think it's something of a mistake, or to put it in the positive sense. There's a nuance here when you talk about the government. We always talk about the government in litigation, but to me there is a different pitch to be made to the administration than to Congress, because the problem with the Obama administration is that they're not doing anything to solve the problem. They say they want to do the right thing, and you think in their heart of hearts, or at least I do, that if Obama didn't have any political obstacles, he would have done a lot more than he did. So I don't think you can use the same kind of advocacy with the administration as you would use in Congress, for example. You were talking about the NDAA. You know, there's pending legislation now, as you know, to update, come out with a new NDAA for the next year. It's not going to affect the provisions we were challenging in the Hedges case, but our side winds up being defensive because we're not going to make any progress, but we have to keep things from being walked back. For example, one senator, Aouyet, proposed an amendment that would authorize shipboard detention, which the Bush people did. I mean, that's sort of horrible. Feinstein introduced an amendment that was adopted that guarantees a jury trial right when you're detained, but only if you are a citizen or a lawful permanent resident, and it implicitly endorses the idea of apprehension in the United States.
There's actually, just quickly, there's some dispute about that fact, David. It doesn't stipulate whether it's a jury trial, civil court, or military court.
That's right.
Which is sort of a fatal flaw in that amendment.
I completely agree, I'm just kind of making a point, and maybe it's not appropriate here for the subject we're discussing, that the mass actions that are being conducted now, and properly so, are aimed at preventing things that make things worse, whereas advocacy with the administration should be, I think, more positive. That please do what you promised to do. Don't tolerate this. So anyway, it's just a difference in nuance, in my opinion.
Sure. And sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, well, I know where you're coming from, David. I mean, the fact is that, you know, that President Obama is now in his second term, and as the United States has the wisdom not to allow people to go further than 2 terms, unlike here in the UK, you know, you end up with second-term presidents who can have their legacy issues very clearly spelled out to them. And this is the case with President Obama, that I'm sure you're right about the, given perfect conditions, things would be a lot better than they are in terms of Guantanamo and other national security problems. But as it stands, and the problems that have been encountered, then it's a question of, I think, now trying to nudge him on his legacy, to say it doesn't matter how politically difficult it appears. You know, history will not look favorably on you as the man who said you would deal with this and then didn't. History will not look favorably on Guantanamo. Now, you know, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld hope in their heart of hearts, I'm sure, that the history books will say there came a time when great robustness and a loose regard for the law was needed, and these gentlemen were the ones who went forward and did that. Now, the history books are not going to do that. The history books are going to not going to deal very favorably with what was introduced after 9/11. So we have legacy issues with President Obama, which clearly, like you say, David, is a very different issue to what's required, whatever it may be required, to try and change the minds of people in Congress. So pushing positively for the president to do things is obviously a very useful thing to do.
If I can play devil's advocate here, because you look at it from when you're trying to push Obama, it's something to keep in mind. I don't know what effect it has, but it's something to keep in mind. You talk about legacy issues. What's more important for his legacy, passing the Obamacare legislation or freeing 170 men from Guantanamo? Should he have risked a single positive vote on the healthcare legislation by pushing the Guantanamo issue? I think you're going to be in the same kind of situation with the fiscal cliff, which I still don't completely understand. and you know, it's very, very complicated from the administration standpoint. And I don't mean to be an apologist for it. It's just that as our friend Rahm Emanuel used to say, you move anything on the chessboard, and you have to see all the other things that move. And again, I'm not making excuses for them. I just think that he has limited ability to move everything, and I think from his standpoint, the things that will affect 200 million, 300 million Americans for years to come takes precedence over leaning forward on Guantanamo.
If it was to be that simple, David, I agree. I mean, I think the first term, one of the problems that we saw was that President Obama was desperate to try and retain a consensus with a Republican Party that had no interest in supporting anything that he intended to do at all. I think the important thing here is that, of course, activities that are going to impact hundreds of millions of American people are going to be a bigger thing than anything. But the question of Guantanamo is not just the physical presence of 166 men there. It's the fact that the United States presides over a situation in which the majority of those men are indefinitely detained. And as it stands at present, through a number of changes that have happened to the system that was set up by President Bush nearly 11 years ago, it is a process of indefinite detention. As it stands now, people will be held there for the rest of their lives in a way that nobody objectively can regard as acceptable for the United States to be presiding over a system of indefinite detention in that way. So it's that's the important thing. And I agree, 166 people doesn't sound like many, and we've always known all along that none of them are American citizens, so that adds another layer of indifference across the board, unfortunately. But the core issues of what's at stake here are fundamentally important. And things like the NDAA and the problems that we've seen with the proposals for the mandatory military detention of terrorist suspects in future, whether they are American citizens or not, has only arisen because it is now tolerated that people can be indefinitely detained.
Right. So that kind of leads into this shifting landscape. What we may have cheered or at least accepted over 10 years ago in the aftermath of 9/11, which was giving our president the power to go after the planners of the 9/11 attacks and members of al-Qaeda or the Taliban, has really morphed into something else altogether, where innocent people are swept up in this net and facing the abject horrors of indefinite detention, which I don't think we've really quite gotten into today. I mean, I've read a bit about a day in the life of Adnan Latif. And David, if you've been to Guantanamo, can you describe for us sort of the typical conditions for a detainee in indefinite detention at Guantanamo Bay?
Well, I'd start off by saying that everybody's in indefinite detention in Guantanamo from a practical standpoint. But, again, I sound like an administration cheerleader, which I'm definitely not. But the one thing that the Obama administration should get credit for is the substantial improvement in the conditions of confinement of the vast majority of detainees there. I mean, being in prison is being in prison, and being in prison without being charged is worse. But over time, especially after Admiral Walsh came down there to inspect at the beginning of the Obama administration to see whether everything was complying with Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, he came back and he says, yes, they are, and then they proceeded to make improvements. And the men can now live in communal circumstances. They're allowed virtually unlimited rec time. There are all sorts of things that make being in Guantanamo just incomparably more humane than being in a federal prison or a state prison. The guards in general no longer do physical brutality. I think, there's still psychological problems that weigh on the men, but I think basically the camp people there, the people who are running the camp, are not rolling back the clock to Bush days, but they're pushing the hands forward. So with respect to the vast majority of men, I think things are better, more humane than they ever were, okay? But then there are other men, such as Adnan, such as Shakir Amir, with whom Andy is very familiar, and hunger strikers who are treated abominably and very much like detainees were treated in 2002. So again, I'm being long-winded, but for the vast majority, things are more humane than they ever were. For the handful of people like Adnan and Shakir, nothing has changed.
Go ahead, Andy.
Say if I could. I mean, I appreciate your point about the conditions there now, David, and I appreciate to some extent what you're saying about a comparison that you're making with it being more favourable to federal court prisons. But the problem, which you didn't underline seriously enough in that, is that the fundamental difference between the men at Guantanamo and the men in federal court prisons is that although there are obviously, it's a system rife with miscarriages of justice, they have been through a process of a trial and a conviction and sentencing, whereas the men in Guantanamo, however comfortable it is, have two things that separate them from any other prisoner. One is which that they do not know when, if ever, their detention is going to come to an end. And the other is that although I know that now all the people who, behave themselves, all the people apart from the hunger strikers and the people regarded as troublesome, are now able to talk on the phone and have even video talks with their families. None of the people at Guantanamo have ever had a single family visit, which is a situation that is not something that is comparable to a federal court system where people are allowed family visits. That's always been something that is desperately cruel and inhumane, and it remains the case for everybody at Guantanamo. So I just thought it was worth mentioning that, really.
And I think also, too, we should really remind people that a good number of the people detained at Guantanamo are completely innocent. So not only are they living in these kinds of conditions, and I hear you, David, that the conditions are remarkably improved, and kudos to Obama for ensuring that that happened, but many of these men were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or, have very, very distant connections. I mean, they're not terrorists as we consider terrorists in any way, shape, or form.
Well, the problem has been that the place is regarded as somewhere that's full of terrorists. The shorthand that all of the enthusiasts for Guantanamo use is that it's full of terrorists. It never has been. It has been predominantly full of innocent people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, or people who were engaged in some form of combat or support for combat in an inter-Muslim civil war in Afghanistan that before 9/11 between two different groups of Muslims, the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. Now, under any kind of circumstances, these people should have been held as prisoners of war, but that was not a route that the Bush administration took. It's never something that has been implemented. So they remain these people who, have no rights, are no categorizable form of prisoner, essentially, however it's dressed up, who can be labeled as crazy bastards or as terrorists by whichever opportunistic lawmaker wants to use them to play their fear-mongering games. But the truth is, as you say, the majority of these people have no connection with any terrorist activities whatsoever. But that's part of the structural lies of the place that have proven so difficult to make people care about, or even in a lot of cases to break through. Donald Rumsfeld stood up when the prison opened and said, these guys are the worst of the worst. What an amazing piece of black propaganda that turned out to be, sadly.
Tangerine, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It's something that I always get. People will say, are your clients guilty?
Mm-hmm.
And I say to them, guilty of what? And they can never tell me. What? And when you say they're innocent, I say, innocent of what? And nobody can answer that question either, because
right.
for one thing, they haven't been charged with anything, so you can't predetermine their, quote, innocence or guilt, but we don't even know what the standard should be that defines innocence or guilt, because you don't know innocent or guilty of what.
Well, especially if we're not really talking about crimes, David. So, so in an armed conflict situation, then being engaged in armed conflict isn't about being a criminal. It's about being a soldier. Things have become so twisted since 9/11 and so twisted in the war on terror that, the lowest point, I think, one of the lowest points that was reached at Guantanamo and it was under President Obama, was when the war crimes trial went ahead for Omar Khadr, a Canadian who was a child when he was captured after a military battle in Afghanistan, who, to get out of Guantanamo, had to agree to a plea deal in which he said that being engaged in military combat against U.S. forces in Afghanistan meant that he was a war criminal. That is disgraceful on every level.
I'll play devil's advocate once again. As a defense lawyer, you're in the military commission. You can make plea deals that are far more favorable to you than you could make in federal court. And the jury, which imposes the sentence, isn't constrained by the sentencing guidelines, which result in horrendously unfair sentences. So while people say, in principle, these men should be tried in federal court because federal court is legitimate and military commissions are not, and the principle of the thing, in reality, as a practical matter, you're better off if you're tried in a military commission.
Yeah, I know what you're saying, David, and two responses to that. One, most of these people are not being held for crimes which ought to be triable under any circumstances. They're not criminals. There are no criminals.
I'll give you that.
You know, so it's an absurd situation. We're in a situation where we have people at Guantanamo who are nobodies. I mean, there are a group of Afghan prisoners at Guantanamo. These poor guys, there are a number of them were put forward for trials by military commission under President Bush. They're not guilty of anything. They know nothing about anything. You know, I know from the stories of Guantanamo, they've been going around prisoners trying to get them to come up with some information that they can use so that they can cut a plea deal with them in the military commission trials, give them a sentence of a few years and send them home. There are people in Guantanamo who've got nothing to give. They can't come up with a story about anybody, about anything, because they never did anything in the first place. So, you know, the people who really are the innocent people in Guantanamo, the people with no involvement with anything, are at the moment the people who are the furthest from the door out of the place. It's absurd. It really is a Kafkaesque Alice in Wonderland place. You know, the last two living prisoners to leave Guantanamo were both people who had sorted out plea deals in their trials by military commission. People who were regarded as amongst the most significant prisoners in Guantanamo. They were the last two people to leave. The nobodies, they cannot get out of that place.
Well, that's right. But all I was trying to do was make the point that if I were going to be tried, if I had the choice of being tried before a military commission or a federal court, I'd much rather be tried before a military commission.
Fair enough.
From the standpoint of my own selfish interests.
Wow, that's sort of an amazing thing to hear, David, because you know, some of the things that you both touched upon in the last few minutes actually are a good segue into talking about the NDAA. And I want to switch gears for a minute and go into the NDAA because, David, you've been in court with us. You've witnessed firsthand what we've experienced with the Department of Justice attorneys. And just a quick recap for our audience. As everyone knows, the Hedges v. Obama lawsuit is we're suing against a provision in the NDAA called Section 1021, which we allege is unconstitutional on two fronts. It contravenes the First and Fifth Amendments, and an Obama-appointed federal judge agreed entirely with our arguments and excoriated the United States government for its stance in this case. The government did not bring forth any evidence, brought forth no witnesses, and actually claimed in court on March 29th that the plaintiffs, myself and 6 others, could actually be indefinitely detained for exercising our First Amendment rights of association or expression. They then backpedaled when they sort of realized that that was as absurd as it sounded, and they backpedaled and they qualified that stance by claiming that as long as our advocacy and journalism efforts were, quote, independent enough, we would be safe from indefinite detention. Just to fast forward in this case, we won a temporary injunction, and later we won a permanent injunction against 1021. Judge Forrest very strongly declared that provision to be entirely unconstitutional and the language to be unconstitutionally vague. The government, though, did win a stay on our injunction because the DOJ is claiming that the United States would incur an irreparable harm should the government lose the powers of indefinite detention under 1021, even though they have not lost those powers under the authorization for use of military force. So that recap, after that recap, I guess what I'd like to do, you know, we've just talked about the inhumane conditions at Guantanamo. David, you mentioned something that was rather astounding to me, that you'd rather face a military trial than a civil trial. Let's talk about the NDAA.
Or the
Sorry, go ahead.
military commissions.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the NDAA, because essentially, although we have this sort of bias due to this black propaganda, Andy, that you mentioned, we have this image, I think, in our heads of the men at Guantanamo and what they must be like. They're the other, they're dangerous, they're terrorists. We've seen today that that's not necessarily the case. I'm sure some of them are not good people, but a good number of them were completely innocent. What is the difference between the men at Guantanamo who have been caught up in that net and the DOJ of the United States government saying that if you're not, quote, independent enough, you too can be indefinitely detained, or war correspondents can be indefinitely detained under the NDAA? I want to talk about that. So, David or Andy.
I think that the NDAA of 2012, and for the benefit of people who don't live by acronyms, it's the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which basically authorizes the expenditure of funds for the Defense Department. That's what it's about. It had engrafted on it a provision, Section 1021, which it really poses a threat to the First Amendment and really expands the detention authority that the government has been asserting. I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question or not, Tangerine, but the position that we've taken in the Hedges litigation is that the law is so vague that if you're a journalist or an author or any kind of person engaged in First Amendment protected expression, you don't know whether you're going to be detained, put before a military commission, rendered to a third country for what you write, because the standard under the statute is, have you, quote, substantially supported, unquote, the terrorist groups, beginning with
right, which is not defined. Substantially is nowhere defined in the language of this law, correct? Okay.
That's why it presents the First Amendment issue, and also there's a due process issue, as Tangerine said, because it violates due process to prosecute you for something you had no way of knowing would be prosecutable. So that came in 2012, and unfortunately, with the renewal of the Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2013, 1021 will be unaffected. It will remain in force, and the only question we have right now is whether and how much worse Congress will make the detention provisions.
Well, and I'd like Andy to jump in here as well, but I just want to preface with this question, statement and question. So firstly, one of the things that has been so striking about our lawsuit is that the Department of Justice has continually conflated the authorization for use of military force of 2001 with the NDAA in detention powers of 2012. And the AUMF had very narrow detention powers. The people who were subject to indefinite detention under that law were people who planned 9/11 or who were members of Al-Qaeda or the Taliban. We allege in court that 1021 offers a sort of a new sweeping expansion of powers with these really broad and vague definitions of associated forces and substantial support. And of course, the judge agreed with us. So there's this pattern of disingenuousness on the part of the government. In our case, just as there has historically been this pattern of, I guess, lawlessness, maybe just disingenuousness on the part of my government at Guantanamo. I mean, are we seeing just sort of the abrogation of the rule of law by the United States, and how do we start to hold these various, these institutions, super powerful institutions accountable? How do we start redressing some of this and reversing some of these trends? So first, Andy.
Well, it's difficult because when we talk about elements of the NDAA, it's very difficult for people even to quite agree on. In Congress, every year now we have people not even quite knowing what they're voting on.
Right.
We've set up such weird legislation has been set up because it's straying from a common sense and acceptable and traditional and universally accepted historical point of view when it comes to, again, it's detention issues. It's how you deal with people when you're depriving them of their liberty. And obviously, this is a huge question that is being discussed and has been discussed for many years. I suppose since the Bush administration's arrogance started to unravel, and people on all different sides started to question what had happened, and a lot of people obviously started to point out what was so horribly wrong about it. But other people, I'm thinking of Ben Witters really at Lawfare, who's spent many, many years now making a career out of arguing that actually we have...
He's a friend of David's, by the way.
We have these threats and they need codifying in new ways. I've spoken on a panel with Ben. I invited him to come and do something in Washington, D.C. a couple of years ago, but, I completely disagree with Ben on every point. It was interesting when he analyzed the Guantanamo prisoner cases because he tends to believe everything the government says. Whereas I have a very healthy skepticism about most of what passes for evidence, as does David, because we know that it wasn't obtained through reliable means.
I'm not skeptical. I disbelieve everything the government says.
Yeah, well, exactly, David. Yeah. But, the problem is that nobody even quite knows what the legislation is. But lawmakers are constantly working on territory that everybody should have left. And that territory is one in which they're trying to invent new forms of detention to replace the ones that existed before 9/11. And to my mind, nobody has made any convincing argument for saying that that's necessary. I still believe that you need to hold people either as criminal suspects and give them trials, or you need to hold them as prisoners of war and treat them according to the Geneva Conventions. I don't believe there is a necessity for everything else, but I understand the mechanisms that work, because there's another part of this story that we can look at, which goes back to the 70s and the 80s and problems with the United States government being involved in the assassination of enemies, and how that reached a point of paralysis in the 1990s under President Clinton. So an extraordinary rendition was come up with. After 9/11, that was expanded on an industrial scale by the Bush administration. And in this long picture of how to deal with people who are regarded as extraordinary enemies, the change from the extraordinary rendition and torture and secret prison scenario that the Bush administration had is President Obama's drone killings of people all around the world who he doesn't like, without any form of due process involved. That's another huge thing that's going on, but it's also still tied in with how we treat our enemies. The thing that I've specifically been dealing with, and David has, is the detention issue. And, nobody has demonstrated to me that any of this is necessary. The authorization for use of military force, actually, this very small and very sweeping document, which doesn't just, give the president the right to pursue the people responsible for 9/11, Al-Qaeda and or the Taliban. It is also, people who supported them, people who harbored them. It has actually functioned very well to detain everybody that has needed to be detained. But clearly what's happening with the NDAA provisions is that certain people within the administration, in the Department of Justice, I don't know what the chain of command is on this, but they're reaching out to cover themselves for things which are either imminent or are happening now, where they don't think that the NDAA adequately covers. So on that point, it's clear they've been lying. They're not the same. The AUM and the NDAA are not the same, those provisions. But quite what it is, I'm not sure. But it's taking us further from where we need to be, which is that we need to come back and we need to find a way to get people to agree that the way that we operated before 9/11, I sometimes say this on September 10, 2001, how we behaved then and how we regarded the law is a place that we need to find a way to get.
So just to clarify, who else can now be detained in Guantanamo Bay and related facilities worldwide as a result of Section 1021B2?
Of the NDAA.
Well, that
we don't know yet,
NDAA, sorry.
I don't think we know yet, do we? Is it being used?
One thing we know is that Section 1021B2 describes a class of people far broader than the class of people covered by the AUMF. The AUMF was linked to 9/11, and it was not forever. It was not applied sort of subjectively. Well, I mean, to a certain extent it was, but again, it was linked. It also had a specific purpose, which was to prevent people from doing again what they had done in 9/11. And it said nothing about going after, quote, associated forces. And it also authorized going after people who have threatened our allies. So it basically unmoors the detention power from any kind of reasonable limitations, any limitations at all. It's really terrible, and all the while the government says, oh, well, you know, we had this power under the AUMF. There's no difference, so what are you worrying about? But it's like Chico in Duck Soup, his famous comment, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes?
Right.
Us, leave us. And Judge Forrest, bless her, just didn't accept that.
Yes, bless her heart. She was. I hope she isn't a once-in-a-lifetime kind of judge, because I hope we get people like her going forward. But my goodness, she certainly stood on the side of the Constitution in our case thus far. Right. So, you know, we're going to have to wrap up. I think we've reached our hour, but I've got a few minutes just to kind of wrap this up and conclude our conversation today. Pamela, do you have any burning questions you want to throw out here for either of these two?
Sure. Well, I don't really have a burning question, but just a statement that I just would like to see if you agree with. Basically, 2 generations ago, collectively as a species, we decided that indefinite detention without trial was illegal. And this is a giant step backwards for all of us. Would you agree with that?
I agree with that, absolutely. You know, I think that the entire premise of it is wrong, that we had before 9/11 ways of depriving people of their liberty which were perfectly adequate. You know, I want people to go away from this program if they've been listening and they want to know what the story is, to know that, you know, that it is a bad thing across the board. There is no justification for holding any of these people at Guantanamo indefinitely. There are various, you know, as I said at the beginning, there are various problems that have caused that. There have been things that President Obama has or hasn't done. There has been profound intervention from Congress. There has been intervention at various levels by the courts as well. Every branch of the United States government, in fact, has failed the Guantanamo prisoners and has failed to shut down this system of indefinite detention. But in parting, I would say that the first thing that people need to focus on, if they regard this as an unjust place, and I hope they do, is that as we approach the 11th anniversary of its opening, the 12th year of its operation, over half of the 166 men held there have been cleared for release by the United States government, but are still held. Adnan Latif, who died, was one of those men. That remains such a profound disgrace that you have said to people, and many of these people were told under President Bush, we don't want to hold you anymore, you can go home. Also under President Obama, and yet they are still held. If people care about their country claiming to represent in any way justice and fairness, then they need to understand that Guantanamo is the thorn in the side of that will not go away until it is dealt with, and it will not be dealt with until the American people care about it. So, you know, that's my big thing. And it's been great to have this discussion this evening.
There's nothing I can add to what Andy just said. There's nothing I can say to improve it, so I'll just keep my mouth shut.
Well, brilliant from both of you, and we're so thrilled to have had the opportunity to have you with us today. I'd actually like to do this again because I think that there are so many stories that the two of you probably have to tell about your arduous work to protect the liberties of people everywhere. So thank you for all that you do, and thank you for being with us today. Just quickly before we sign off, though, I want to say for our audience, if you've missed any of this broadcast, you can find it, the podcast, probably by tomorrow on RevolutionTruth.org, or blogs.revolutiontruth.org, sorry. And we'll be tweeting that out as well. And our next panel, we actually will have a former guard from Guantanamo in its earliest years and two prisoners whom he befriended much later, Brandon Neely and two fellows in the UK. So thank you, Andy and David, for being with us today. Thank you, Pamela, for co-hosting this. We've really enjoyed having you.
Thank you.
Thank you.